Keremeos. Keremeos is a village in British Columbia. The name originated from the Similkameen dialect of the Okanagan language word meaning creek which cuts its way through the flats. This refers to the Keremeos Creek, which flows down from the Upper Benchlands to the Similkameen River that flows past the village. The geography of the Keremeos area ranges from cottonwood groves along the river to orchards and farms to desert-like landscapes along the base of the surrounding mountains up to the alpine peaks and plateau.
Keremeos' main industries are horticulture, agriculture, ranching, and winemaking. Fruit stands are a pillar of the local economy, making it the fruit stand capital of Canada. All sorts of fruits, apples, cherries, peaches, as well as vegetables are grown here. In the 2021 Canadian census, the population of Keremeos was slightly more than 1,600. Known for its senior population, nearly half of its residents are age 65 or older.
Keremeos has a semi-arid climate with cool but short winters and hot, dry summers. Precipitation is low at 323 millimeters, 13 inches, and evenly distributed throughout the year. The area has a mild, dry climate with summer temps around 30 to 32 degrees Celsius. The hottest month is August. In winter, temperatures vary from 1 to 7 degrees Celsius. The coldest month is December. Annual rainfall is 268 millimeters, and annual snowfall is 50 centimeters.
Keremeos resident, historian, and author Wallace Liddicoat advises the first reference to aviation in the area occurred in 1925. Tom Hunter of nearby Olalla was reported to have been apprehended while using an aircraft to attempt to smuggle narcotics. On September 2nd, 1934, John A. Wilson, Controller of Civil Aviation for the Department of National Defense, toured the unemployment relief camps in southwestern BC. Wilson stopped at Keremeos to inspect the small emergency field under construction near the community. This is the only official reference Liddicoat found about an airfield at Keremeos.
Dan MacGyver was an RCAF pilot with number 124 Ferry Squadron during the Second World War, flying between Lethbridge and Vancouver. In 1946, MacGyver went to work flying for a Penticton fruit farmer, Dave Smith, as the chief pilot for Philby and Smith Airways. He flew joyrides for residents of Oliver and Keremeos.
MacGyver and Smith cleared rocks and sagebrush for a small strip at Keremeos on top of the low hill north of the junction of Highways 3 and 3A. The Keremeos Chamber of Commerce became interested in an airfield. The chamber prevailed upon the Public Works Department to grade a northeast to southwest strip adjacent to and west of the road to Penticton and above the town site.
Pilot Dan MacGyver remembers that he struggled out of the strip with 2 passengers in the back of a Piper J5 Cub cruiser, CFDNW. Other aircraft used in their barnstorming were Piper J3 Cub, CFDCM, and a Taylor craft BC-12D CFDBP. Princeton. Princeton is a town in the Similkameen region of southern British Columbia. The former mining and railway hub lies at the confluence of the Tulameen and Similkameen rivers, just east of the Cascade Mountains at the junction of BC Highways 3 and 5A. By road, Princeton is about 67 kilometers or 42 miles northwest of Keremeyeus, 133 kilometers or 83 miles east of Hope, and 90 kilometers or 56 miles south of Merritt.
The First Nations are part of the interior Salish of the Thompson language group. In 1812, Alexander Ross of the Pacific Fur Company was the first European to explore the Similkameen River. During the 1860s, Princeton was the administrative center for the Similkameen district. In the 1870s, the Fork was a cattle center. Herds were driven over the mountain trail to Hope. By 1900, the town had a restaurant, 2 hotels, 2 livery stables, 2 butcher shops, 2 blacksmith shops, 2 laundries, 3 sawmills, as well as government buildings.
The town of Princeton relies heavily on copper mining. The copper ore was originally found in 1883. The first underground pit was opened in 1923 and continued until 1957. The mine is still called Copper Mountain Mine. However, it is owned by the Hudbay Minerals. This mine has generated income and jobs for Princeton locals and has become a tourist attraction as one of the largest copper mines in Canada. In 2021, the population in Princeton was almost 2,900 people.
Princeton is known as Canada's bronze sculpture capital. It also offers outdoor recreation, such as hiking on the China Ridge trails and skiing at nearby Apex, as well as pioneer and mining history at the Princeton Museum. Key industries include forestry, mining, ranching, and tourism. Princeton features a dry continental climate with extreme seasonal variations, hot, dry summers, and cold, snowy winters. Over the year, the temperature typically varies from -10 to 27 degrees Celsius and is rarely below -19 degrees or above 33 degrees Celsius.
In mid-June 1919, Princeton was visited by Captain Ernest C. Hoy to arrange the arrival of the first airplane to land at Princeton. Hoy was accompanied by Captain George Dixon. Both were members of the Aerial League of Vancouver and were Royal Flying Corps pilots in the First World War.
The event was scheduled for July 12, 1919, at the racetrack grounds. The aircraft to be used was a Curtiss JN-4 Canuck and was supposed to be the same aircraft to be used in a forthcoming attempt to cross the Rocky Mountains to Calgary and return. The Princeton Star did not report whether Hoy actually arrived on July 12th and carried out his stunt performance. However, the July 18th edition of the Merritt Herald reported that due to high winds, Hoy and Dixon were unable to proceed to Princeton as planned.
The July 4th edition of the Princeton Star gives a detailed report on Lieutenant Ernest Hall's arrival at 5:16 p.m. in Princeton, after a flight from Vancouver and another JN4 owned by the Vancouver Aerial Transport Company. Hull had landed at Chilliwack to refuel and had a difficult flight to Princeton. He had followed the Kettle Valley Railway along the Coquihalla Pass and had difficulty climbing above the terrain. The flight had taken 1 hour and 55 minutes, and the aircraft carried only 2 hours worth of fuel.
Hall was concerned about his fuel situation. In his own words, he needed to get near some gas. In desperation, he landed on Princeton's Bridge Street, which he accomplished successfully, tearing out the town's telegraph wires. Hall taxied the aircraft to an automobile garage at the north end of town and filled her up. He taxied out the same way and took off for Penticton, where he was scheduled to perform on Dominion Day, July 1st, 1919. After this, Hall went to Oroville, Washington, to perform in its 4th of July celebration.
On July 5th, Hull, accompanied by Air Mechanic Dudley Smith, set out from Penticton to go back to Vancouver via Princeton. After landing at Princeton and refueling, they again set out for the coast. They were unable to get enough altitude to clear the Coquihalla Pass. Hull turned back and landed at Princeton. This time, he used a grass field on a hill at the fair and racetrack grounds on 5 Mile Road north of town. Hull later took off and returned to Penticton, where he installed a gas tank in the front passenger seat and sent Smith home by train. Hull then successfully took off and flew non-stop to Chilliwack. It would be some time before the Princeton would again see an airplane land at their community.
During 1928, the Dominion government began a survey of potential routes for the Trans-Canada Airway throughout southern British Columbia. This would include an airfield at Princeton. On April 26, 1929, the Grand Forks Gazette reported that the Princeton Board of Trade had approved the site for an airfield on the Darcy Mountain Road, near the old coal mine and very close to Princeton. The May 22, 1929 edition of the Grand Forks Gazette reported that a pilot, James Roblin of Winnipeg, acting on behalf of a commercial aviation enterprise, was assessing the potential airmail routes across BC. He told the reporter, quote, "Princeton has a very good airplane landing area on their old racetrack. If it were put in shape, it would suit their purpose splendidly," unquote.
William Archibald was the mining manager of the Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company at Trail. At the age of 53, he caught the flying bug and learned to fly. Archibald purchased a de Havilland DH-60M Gypsy Moth CFAAI from Dominion Airways at Vancouver on May 18, 1929, and set out for trail on the 23rd of June. William Bolton, a one-armed air engineer of Aero Club of BC, went with him. It is likely that Humphrey Madden and Joe Bentolino were in Princeton from time to time after they moved from Vancouver to Kamloops in 1930 and flew from town to town to raise money during the Depression. They went to Merritt, Armstrong, Grand Forks, Trail, and probably Princeton.
The federal government authorized the Unemployment Relief Scheme in October 1932. Single homeless men were given work developing airports for the future Trans-Canada Airway. Princeton was selected as an intermediate aerodrome on the Vancouver-Lethbridge section. Men were brought in from a large relief camp at Cranbrook. No heavy equipment was used, only axes and picks, shovels and wheelbarrows. A radio communication facility was also established at Princeton in conjunction with the Trans-Canada Airway.
In early September 1934, J.A. Wilson, who was Controller of Civil Aviation, inspected the progress in the construction of this section, which included Princeton's aerodrome. He then continued to Vancouver via Merritt. B. Zed Louis Lee was a Canadian Airway pilot who was selected to start an instrument airline course for company pilots in anticipation of the Trans-Canada Airway. On September 29, 1936, Lee was flying alone eastbound for Lethbridge in CFAQY, a Liard LC-B-200 used for instrument training by the airline. Lee became physically affected by an exhaust leak. He landed and overnighted at Princeton before refueling and continuing eastward.
On August 21st, 1937, Lee was back in Princeton, now with Trans-Canada Airlines. TCA had taken over the instrument flight program from Canadian Airways. Lee was TCA's representative on a survey to determine radio range locations on the southern BC Airway to Lethbridge. Part of the group traveled in the Department of Transport Lockheed 12 CFCCT, flown by squadron leader J.H. Tudhope, who was known as Tuddy, and Inspector Jack Hunter. The rest of the party traveled by DOT automobile.
By the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, the Princeton radio range was commissioned 1/2 mile northeast of the airport. An instrument approach was devised using the radio range, which would allow aircraft to descend in cloud to within 2,000 feet above the airport. The airport was used by the Royal Canadian Air Force throughout the war, but was operated by the Department of Transport. The Department of Transport continued to operate and maintain in the post-war years.
On September 18, 1943, RCAF Bolingbroke number 9032 flew over the Princeton airport, photographing the airport as part of a detailed survey. A 1943 RCAF Airway manual shows the Princeton Airfield as being 5,660 by 800 feet turf. Flying Officer George Williamson recalls landing an RCAF Grumman Goose there in May 1944, stating, quote, "The Goose hull was pitted with gravel strikes," unquote.
By 1968, the single runway was still 5,660 feet long by 300 feet wide. The Department of Transport closed its air radio facility at Princeton during the 1970s and operated remotely via Penticton. The runway was eventually paved for 3,932 feet. During the late 1970s and throughout the 80s, the Royal Canadian Air Cadets of the Pacific region operated a glider school during the summer months, using Princeton Airport to train the successful candidates in the glider scholarship program. Today, Princeton Regional Airport, known as CYDC, is a municipal airport with a 3,932-foot runway, automated fuel service, terminal and aircraft tie-downs. It serves general aviation, including private and commercial flights.